Have you ever wondered how a single passage of water could become the hinge point of human history? It did not happen by accident. Tectonic forces folded the Earth until the Persian Gulf narrowed into a single corridor 21 miles wide, positioned at the precise junction between East and West. For 5,000 years, whoever controlled this water controlled the world's breath. The Persians first. Then the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British. Then oil rewrote every calculation entirely. Every major power on Earth has a contingency plan for this strait. Every naval fleet in the region knows its coordinates by memory. Every oil market in the world moves when someone in a press briefing says its name. $21 million barrels a day. 1/5 of everything the modern world burns to stay alive. It does not see the 6,000 people living on a volcanic salt island with no groundwater, no arable soil, and no share in the trillion-dollar flow passing their windows every single day. How people live in the most strategically dangerous strait on Earth, and why the world has never bothered to ask. This is the story of the Strait of Hormuz, and of the people the world forgot to look at while it was watching the water. Hormuz Island sits at the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz, roughly 5 miles off the coast of southern Iran, where the Persian Gulf narrows into a choke point just 21 miles wide at its tightest passage. It is a small island, barely 8 miles across, yet its surface reads like a geological archive of 600 million years, compressed into visible bands of red ochre, sulfur yellow, deep violet, rusted orange, and chalky white that stripe the hillsides with a chromatic intensity that seems, at close range, to belong to a different atmosphere entirely. NASA has noted that the island's chemical composition resembles the surface of Mars more closely than almost anywhere else on Earth, a comparison that feels less like metaphor and more like literal fact when you stand on its ridgelines at midday. For the people who live here, this landscape is not unreal. It is everyday life. Women walk to the shoreline each morning to collect red earth from outcroppings of Golak iron oxide-rich soil, so concentrated that local cuisine incorporates it directly, mixed into fermented fish sauce, and spread onto flatbread as a morning meal. The geology does not remain outside the home. It enters the kitchen, the body, the daily rhythm of life, in a way that collapses the distance between environment and identity. Hormuz became this way through a mechanism called salt diapirism. Ancient Precambrian salt deposits, buried under immense pressure, slowly forced their way upward through the crust over hundreds of millions of years, dragging minerals, basalt, and iron compounds with them, rupturing the surface into this improbable palette. The island did not choose to look this way. It was pushed into it. Today, the arrival of tourists drawn by photographs of colored Earth has introduced a new pressure foot traffic, informal mining of the very soil that defines the island, and infrastructure development at odds with the fragility of its surface. What happens when a place becomes famous for being unreal is already being answered here, in the slow erosion of the thing that made it worth visiting. Places like Hormuz remind us that beauty without context is just color, and that the most extraordinary landscapes on Earth are often the ones most poorly equipped to survive our attention. Stars Valley lies in the interior of Keshem Island, the largest island in the Persian Gulf, roughly 22 miles long and located just off Iran's southern coast in the Strait of Hormuz. The valley is not a valley in any conventional sense, but a labyrinthine network of eroded canyons and hollowed pillars carved from soft, sedimentary rock over thousands of years by the combined action of wind, rain, and the particular chemistry of the soil. Walls curve inward above narrow passageways, creating chambers that filter light into something dim and directional. The scale shifts constantly, passages narrow to shoulder width, then open without warning into vaulted spaces where the rock overhead has been sculpted into forms that appear almost intentional. For the people of Keshem, the valley has never required scientific explanation. Local belief holds that the formations were shaped by falling meteorites, and that the valley retains something of the energy of that celestial contact. At night, residents describe the silence as absolute, broken only by wind moving through the passages in patterns that change with season and direction. The place is not visited for leisure, it is approached with a particular caution that acknowledges its difference from the surrounding landscape. The geology is, in fact, no less remarkable than the legend. Alternating layers of gypsum, sandstone, and salt have eroded at different rates, leaving behind structures that record geological time in visible cross-sections. A single wall face may contain strata representing tens of thousands of years of deposition. Today, Stars Valley receives visitors whose presence, however quiet, has begun to alter the silence that defines it. Trails cut through formations. Lights have been installed where darkness was the point. What happens when a place becomes famous for being unreal is an ongoing negotiation between the valley's conditions and the world's desire to experience them safely. Places like Stars Valley remind us that some forms of meaning can only exist in the absence of explanation. Along the northern coast of Keshm Island, the Hara Biosphere Reserve extends across approximately 35,000 acres of tidal mudflat and mangrove forest, a living system that has been operating continuously for 30 million years without interruption, without machinery, and without any dependence on the economies that surround it. The trees Avicennia marina, a species adapted to saltwater immersion, grow in dense stands that filter tidal salt through their root systems and excrete it through their leaves as fine white crystals, a biological desalination process that functions with a precision no industrial system has yet replicated at this scale. At low tide, the root networks emerge from the mud in complex aerial formations, engineering their own oxygen supply in an environment that provides almost none. For the fishing communities whose boats move through the narrow tidal channels between the trees, the forest is neither wilderness nor attraction. It is a navigational system, a weather buffer, a nursery for the fish species that define the local economy, and a shelter against the storm surges that periodically move through the strait. Knowledge of the forest's channels is practical knowledge, passed between generations, not as ecological education, but as survival geography. The Hara forest did not arrive here by chance. "30 million years of evolution along this coastline produced a species capable of living where salt, water, and fresh air meet, and where the ground disappears twice each day." That continuity has made this ecosystem one of the most stable in the Persian Gulf. Stable not because it is protected, but because it has spent 30 million years learning how not to fail. Today, rising sea temperatures are pushing the Gulf toward conditions that approach the upper tolerance threshold of the mangrove species. The forest does not respond to news cycles or conservation targets. It responds only to water temperature and tidal rhythm. What happens when a place becomes famous for being unreal is less relevant here than what happens when the water it depends on becomes too warm to sustain it. Places like Hara remind us that the most durable systems on Earth are not the ones we built. They are the ones we have not yet managed to destroy. Dasht-e Lut, the Desert of Emptiness, occupies a basin in southeastern Iran, extending across roughly 20,000 square miles of hyper-arid terrain at an elevation low enough and under a sky clear enough that it has recorded the highest land surface temperatures ever measured on Earth, in excess of 159 degrees Fahrenheit, confirmed by satellite data from NASA's MODIS system. The desert takes its extreme temperature not merely from sun and latitude, but from a combination of basin, geometry, low humidity, and complete absence of vegetation conditions that allow the ground surface to absorb and radiate heat without interruption. The center of the Lut is classified as one of the few places on Earth where nothing living has been confirmed to survive. Not bacteria. Not fungi. Not any organism yet identified. Surrounding this thermal core, however, the landscape shifts into something more complex. Yardang formations, elongated ridges, sculpted by sustained wind erosion over thousands of years, rise up to 150 feet from the desert floor in parallel rows that can extend for miles, creating a city-like geometry from entirely natural processes. The wind that made them continues to move through them, producing sounds that local nomadic groups who pass the desert's edges have described for centuries as voices. No permanent community lives inside the Lut. The caravans that once crossed its margins were routed around its hottest zones through route knowledge accumulated over generations and traded as carefully as any commodity. That routing knowledge, which paths held water, which landforms indicated shade, which stars corresponded to which wells, was survival infrastructure in the most literal sense. Today, the Lut is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which confers protection without resolving the question of what protection means in a place where the primary threat is not human activity, but the steady warming of the atmosphere above it. What happens when a place becomes famous for being unreal is, in this case, almost irrelevant. The Lut's conditions remain largely incompatible with the kind of tourism that might otherwise alter them. Places like Dasht-e Lut remind us that there are still territories on this planet where human ambition has not yet found purchase, and that their persistence is not a failure of development, but a record of limits we have not crossed. Along the southern coast of the Caspian Sea, pressed between the water and the Alborz mountain range in northern Iran, the Hyrcanian forest extends across approximately 850,000 acres of temperate broadleaf woodland that has survived, largely intact, for between 25 and 50 million years. It is one of the oldest continuously existing forest ecosystems on Earth, a fragment of the forest that once covered much of the temperate zone of the ancient world, before glacial periods contracted and shifted vegetation zones across the northern hemisphere. The Hyrcanian persisted through these changes because of an accident of topography. The Alborz range behind it blocked the cold air of the continental interior, and the Caspian in front of it maintained moisture levels sufficient to sustain broadleaf species that disappeared elsewhere in the region. The forest survived by being, in climatic terms, in exactly the right place. For the communities that have lived at its margins for millennia, the Hyrcanian is a resource system of extraordinary density. Wild fruit, mushrooms, medicinal plants, game, and timber in a landscape that receives annual rainfall several times higher than the arid interior of the same country. The contrast between this forest and the deserts less than 500 miles to its south is not merely striking, it is ecologically implausible, the result of mountain geometry rather than latitude. The Hyrcanian became this way by surviving what most similar forests did not: the Pleistocene glaciation, the subsequent aridification of West Asia, and several thousand years of human settlement at its edges. Its continuity is not natural abundance, it is the product of conditions that happened against probability to remain stable. Today, agricultural encroachment from the lowlands below and development pressure from the Caspian coast above are reducing the forest's edges. The interior remains largely intact, but the buffer zones that protect it from temperature and moisture fluctuation are narrowing. What happens when a place becomes famous for being unreal is less relevant here than what happens when the climate corridor that has preserved it for 50 million years begins to shift. Places like the Hyrcanian remind us that the ancient world did not entirely disappear. Parts of it are still here, still functioning, still dependent on conditions we are only beginning to understand. On the eastern shore of Hormuz Island, a fortress built from the island's own red stone rises in partial ruin against the shoreline. Its walls, the same iron-saturated ochre as the cliffs behind it, so consistent in color with the landscape that from certain angles it appears less like a human construction and more like a geological formation that has taken on the approximate shape of a military installation. The Portuguese built it in 1507, following Alfonso de Albuquerque's seizure of the island as part of a strategy to control the strait's trading routes, a strategy that reduced the movement of goods between east and west to a single passage under Portuguese surveillance. For more than a century, the fortress was the physical embodiment of a commercial empire, a stone claim on the geometry of the world. For the people of Hormuz Island, the fortress has always been present in the landscape, neither celebrated nor resented with particular intensity, but absorbed into the island's longer timeline as one more layer deposited by a force that passed through, left its mark, and moved on. The stone came from the island. Eventually, the island is taking it back. The fortress became what it is now: partial ruin, slow dissolution, a wall here and an archway there, through the combined action of salt air, humidity, and the particular chemistry of the local stone, which is too mineral-rich to resist moisture indefinitely. An empire built its monument from a material it did not fully understand, and the material is quietly reclaiming itself. Today, the fortress receives visitors who photograph its archways against the red hillside. Preservation efforts are limited by funding and by the difficulty of stabilizing iron oxide-rich sandstone against a salt-laden coastal atmosphere. What happens when a place becomes famous for being unreal is, here, less urgent than what happens when the material from which empire made its claim proves unable to endure the conditions empire chose to ignore. Places like the Portuguese fortress remind us that every structure built to last forever is, in the end, on loan from the landscape it was taken from. Musandam does not announce itself gradually. It arrives without transition, a wall of limestone rising vertically from the water at the northern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, where the Hajar Mountains abandon their inland geometry and plunge directly into the Strait of Hormuz without apology or slope. The peninsula belongs to Oman, but shares no land border with the rest of the country, separated from the Omani mainland by a strip of UAE territory that makes Musandam, in administrative terms, an exclave, a piece of a nation that cannot reach itself by road. Geographically, politically, and in every atmospheric sense, it occupies a category of its own. The fjords known locally as khors were not carved by glaciers, as their Norwegian equivalents were, but produced by a different and older violence. The Arabian tectonic plate subducting beneath the Eurasian plate, causing the mountain range to fracture and sink at its seaward edge, allowing the Gulf to flood the resulting valleys to depths that charts still struggle to fully render. Walls of grey and ochre limestone rise several hundred feet from water, so still and dark in the inlet shadows that the surface reads as a continuation of the rock rather than a boundary between elements. The geometry is not picturesque in any comfortable sense. It is the geometry of entrapment. Beautiful, yes, but beautiful in the way of things that do not permit easy departure. For the people who live here, this landscape is not a spectacle. It is a set of conditions that determined everything, beginning with the question of where a house could be built at all. The Shihu people, the indigenous inhabitants of Musandam, constructed their villages on ledges and cliff faces at elevations that protected them from the seasonal storms moving through the strait and from the attention of the successive maritime empires that passed through the waters below. Their homes were not built in spite of the terrain, but from within its logic, positioned where the rock offered purchase, and the angle of the slope provided what passed in this landscape for shelter. Movement between villages was vertical as much as horizontal, and the knowledge of which passages through the rock were passable in which seasons was survival knowledge in the most unambiguous sense. The strait that isolated Musandam also placed it at the most strategically observed point in the Persian Gulf. Every supertanker entering or leaving the Gulf must navigate the shipping lanes that run through the core's approaches, threading between headlands where the water shallows and the channel narrows to corridors that leave almost no margin for error. From the cliff tops above, the scale of this passage is visible in a way that no chart conveys the tankers, each carrying more oil than some countries consume in a week, moving at the pace of slow thought through water flanked on both sides by rock. Their hulls within visual range of fishing douse a fraction of their size, the two vessels operating in the same physical space under entirely different understandings of what that space is for. It is one of the most concentrated expressions of the modern world's contradictions available to the unassisted eye. Beneath the shipping lanes of the Strait of Hormuz, in water that receives the shadow of supertanker hulls every few hours and sits at temperatures that exceed tolerance thresholds documented for coral systems almost everywhere else on Earth, something is growing that should not be growing. The coral reefs surrounding Hormuz Island have survived water temperatures consistently reaching and surpassing 35 degrees Celsius, conditions that trigger mass bleaching and mortality across the Indo-Pacific, the Caribbean, and the Red Sea. Here, they persist. The scientific community has not reached consensus on precisely why. The reefs themselves have not waited for the explanation. For the fishing communities that have worked these waters for generations, the reefs are not a biological phenomenon requiring explanation. They are the structure beneath the water that determines where the fish are, how the current moves, and where it is safe to anchor. Their condition registers first, as the presence or absence of the catch fisherman can identify reef degradation in the vocabulary of livelihood before marine biologists can document it in the vocabulary of science, because the fish disappear from the boat before the data appears in the journal. What the reefs represent to science is something rarer than beauty, a living record of what coral can become when forced, over millennia, to operate at the edge of its viable range, accumulating thermal tolerance through generations of survival rather than through any protection we provided. Today, coastal development, ship anchoring, and accelerating ocean temperatures are pushing even these adapted systems toward thresholds they may not clear. Seen from above, Hormuz looks like a fragment of color torn from the mainland and dropped into the middle of the Persian Gulf. Ochre-red cliffs, beaches streaked like a painter's overturned palette, a surface of water that throws sunlight back at the sky with almost aggressive intensity. But behind that dreamlike exterior is a community of real, living people, somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 of them, concentrated mostly in the town on the island's northern edge, just 8 kilometers of open water from the coast of Bandar Abbas. This is not an island built for mass tourism, nor a place people come to in search of comfort. Hormuz is where people are born, grow up, grow old, and die inside a relationship with the sea that has never been optional. For generations, fishermen here have been pushing their boats out onto the turquoise waters of the Persian Gulf before the sun has fully risen. Their daily rhythm is not shaped by clocks or work schedules, but by tides, the same tides that have decided when to set out, when to return, and when to rest for hundreds of years running. In earlier times, when summer heat reached its most punishing extremes, many families would make the crossing to the mainland to sit out the worst months of the year. Today, most of the community stays year-round, adapting to the harsh conditions in the way that only people who have been attached to a place long enough can manage, not by overcoming nature, but by learning to live alongside it. Fishing has always been the backbone of Hormuz's economy, and that has not changed despite everything the outside world has done in the meantime. Wooden boats leave before dawn and come back, carrying shrimp, fish, and sometimes shark species drawn from the deeper waters around the strait. Fish are laid out to dry on net racks along the shoreline, the smell of salt and sea becoming so consistent a feature of the air that it stops registering as a smell and becomes simply the atmosphere of the place. Alongside fishing, the people of the island have gradually opened other paths toward a livelihood. Handicrafts have grown from whatever the island provides in abundance: mineral-rich red soil, shells, pieces of driftwood carried in on the current. Local art in particular has taken on new significance since the sculptor Ahmad Nadalian began transforming the island's beaches into open-air galleries, drawing a stream of visitors and creating a source of income that had not previously existed. Tourism has not replaced the sea. It has supplemented it, a balance that the people of Hormuz are managing carefully, aware that the two are not always easy to hold together. In the traditional social structure of Hormuz, men hold the formal position of authority. But it is women who carry the larger share of the daily labor that keeps households and communities alive. Together with their husbands, they bear the economic weight of the family, managing the home, raising children, and at the same time participating directly in the work of the shoreline drying nets, trading in small goods, producing handicrafts for sale. This is why the Borage mask cannot be understood in isolation from its labor context. The women of Hormuz are not sitting in the shade waiting. They are outside, working under sunlight reflected off open water for decades at a stretch. The mask was their answer to that condition, practical, functional, and over time, transformed into something far more beautiful than its original purpose required. Their clothing makes the same statement in a different register. Deep gold, cobalt blue, and dark crimson are worked into elaborate hand embroidery that carries family and regional meaning, sewn into fabrics built for working life rather than ceremony. In an environment that is physically harsh and a daily life defined by labor, the women of Hormuz chose to exist in color as though that were the way they insisted on being seen by a landscape that is always trying to erase everything in it. The kitchen of Hormuz is the kitchen of a community that has spent centuries living at the world's crossroads. Fish, shrimp, and shark are prepared according to recipes passed down through oral tradition across generations, heavily spiced in the manner of the Indian Ocean basin, shaped by the influence of Indian merchants, East African port cities, and the many peoples who came through this island and left something of themselves behind in the food. But the most unusual element of Hormuz's cuisine comes not from the sea, but from the ground beneath it. The island's red soil, rich in iron oxide and dozens of other minerals, does not only produce the extraordinary landscape that draws visitors from across Iran. It is not only the material that local artists use to paint and sculpt. People here use it to color certain traditional dishes. Hormuz is one of the very few places on Earth where the community genuinely incorporates the soil of their homeland into what they eat, not out of scarcity or necessity, but because it has always been part of a culinary tradition that the island treats as worth keeping. The best way to eat on Hormuz is not to look for a restaurant, because there are almost none. People who come to the island are typically invited into family meals, eating with the people who live there, staying in their homes, sitting by the water in the evening when the heat finally concedes a few degrees and the wind moves in from the sea. Iran is a country the world believes it already understands. Yet beneath the image it has inherited lies a land that, by any modern measure of coherence, should not exist, as it does, held together not by stability but by 600 million years of geological pressure, by linguistic fossils that encode the passage of every empire to have moved through its waters, by communities who learn to eat the earth itself, to drum illness out of the body, to build into rock and rebuild after fire, sustaining a continuity of human presence in conditions that were never designed to make life easy or obvious. As the forces that once defined the margins, extreme heat, geographic isolation, resource scarcity, the slow encroachment of rising seas, move toward the center of the global experience, Iran begins to feel less like a country defined by its contradictions and more like a map of what the rest of the world is moving toward, a future in which adaptation is not a strategy but a condition, in which survival is not the exception but the daily premise of existence. This is not a story that ends here, because the forces that shape this land are not contained by any border, and the question of how human beings live within conditions they did not choose and cannot control continues, far beyond Iran, across every latitude where the world is being asked to reconsider what stability was ever worth believing in.